Well, he's the most famous economist on this program. I'll say that for sure. New Zealand is desperate for an economic recovery, but with international market wobbles and fears of a Trumpcession, which is a Trump-induced recession, I'm told in the US, how vulnerable are we? And should we temper our expectations? Paul Bloxham is HSBC's chief economist. He's in the country from Sydney. It's great to have you in studio. Paul, good evening.
Great to be here.
How obsessed are you with following what Trump is saying every day?
It is my day job to keep up with what is going on, and it is certainly fast-paced, to say the least. I get actually quite a few clients. I do lots of presentations, and I've been doing them here this week as well. And they say, it must be tough to be an economist because there's so many moving parts and so much happening. And I say, because I'm a contrarian, of course, I say, no, it's a great time to be an economist because there's so much going on. And if anything, the economics framework is surely one of the ones that you've got to use to fit the facts together to make some sense of how it goes. So and what you should think about it. And so it's kept me busy.
All right. Well, synthesize it for us then. Is the answer here basically there is so much going on that it all equals uncertainty, and uncertainty is bad?
There's an element of that story. Certainly, when things chop and change a lot, it's difficult for businesses to be able to know which way to move. Are they going to, where are they going to invest? Where are they going to hire? And I think you're starting to see that in some of the business surveys. So that's one aspect of this story. But there's a lot of elements to what's being delivered. There's a trade policy element that's the one that gets all the attention, which is sort of trade tariffs and what's been happening with those. But there's also others. There's the deregulation story and tax cuts that they're proposing as well. So you sort of have to balance out all of the bits of the overall story. I think net we're looking at that there's upside risk to US inflation. And that's something we need to think about in terms of global interest rates and what it means, and the US dollar, which has remained strong. And I think there is some risk to US growth from all of this. But the major thing is it has a flow-on effect to the rest of the world. So the risk overall to the global economy is probably tilted to the downside. So those are the ways, at least some guideposts for thinking about what's going on. I think, of course, here in New Zealand, you want to think about what it means for New Zealand. I think the direct impact is actually fairly small in the scheme of things. The trading relationship's fairly small. New Zealand sells a lot more into the Asian markets and so on. And so I think it's a fairly small effect in overall, but it's not insignificant. But I actually think New Zealand's doing a little bit better. I mean, I think this year you're going to see an upswing in the New Zealand economy. I
think that's what everyone's worried about. Is we all feel the same way, but we're worried someone's going to come and eat our lunch. There's going to be a Donald Trump-shaped bite out of our sandwich that we were expecting to eat this year.
So I think you've got a couple of things going for you. So one of them is, of course, that inflation's come down enough now that the RBNZ's cutting interest rates, and not just by a little bit. They've cut interest rates already by 175 basis points. That's quite a lot of stimulus that's starting to pour into the New Zealand economy. I think you're seeing that showing up in surveys, consumer sentiment surveys, and so on. So that's one tailwind. And the other tailwind you've got is that, dairy prices have risen, meat prices are elevated, you've got more volumes, your terms of trade is positive. So you're going to get a national income tailwind from that story. And both of those things we think will lift growth after a pretty tough year last year in terms of the economy contracting. I think you're going to get quite a decent bounce back through this year, pretty strong bounce back if you look at it through the year. And so those things are at work. And as you say, I guess there's risks out there from the global story. But one of the things to keep in mind is you're tied to the China story a lot. And China is not able. China's story is pivoting more towards the consumer. So instead of being as driven by sort of metals-intensive activities like building factories and building property, they can't do as much of that. They've already done a lot of that, but they're pivoting their own stimulus measure towards the consumer. If the Chinese consumer picks up, which is part of what we think's likely, then that's actually a positive for New Zealand. So there's a few tailwinds here.
You talk about the Reserve Bank, and you've been at this conference in Wellington last week where all the nerds from central banks around the world went and had a little chat. What's the vibe you picked up there about Adrian Orr? I mean, was this quite a shock for people in the money economy world?
I think that everyone was shocked by what happened. I think that's a reasonable surmise. I think the conference was very focused on a celebration, in a way, of the fact that this is the central bank, the RBNZ, the first central bank to have adopted inflation targeting. They did that 35 years ago. And I know your audience will say, well, it's inflation targeting. How good's it been? Actually, it's been a really robust system for being able to manage cycles in economies. And not only has it worked well here, but New Zealand led the way. The RBNZ was the first central bank to do it, and then the other central banks around the world have all adopted the similar sorts of strategies, including the RBA and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. And so, New Zealand was where all this started. It's the best system available for central banks to manage economies. It's not perfect, and you can learn a lot still, but it's the way that central banks go about it. So I think that's a lot of what the conference was really about, was sort of going and looking at how well it's performed and how central bankers can do it better in the future.
One of the biggest complaints you get about this targeting of the way monetary policy operates is that you're taking money away, you're taking money out of people's pockets to try and dampen down, demand and try and have an effect on inflation, and that money just sort of disappears. There are people who say, why don't we have a different system where that money would be put into some kind of savings vehicle or something, rather than just sort of arbitrarily disappearing into the ethos when the Reserve Bank ups the OCR?
Well, there are a number of reasons. I mean, the first one is you're absolutely right to describe it as you're lifting and lowering. And I might add, they've been lowering interest rates recently. So actually what they're doing is actually allowing people more income to spend. They're trying to get the economy to pick up because inflation has come down. But you are setting a policy rate to try to manage the cycles in demand. If demand's picking up too much, you're slowing it down by lifting rates. And likewise, if demand has slowed too much, you start to lower interest rates, and you guide that by looking at the inflation rate, which balances that out. You're right, absolutely, that this is not the only way you could do things. You could actually use your fiscal policy tools. You could set taxes and spending by government and so on, and try and complement what you do in terms of managing that cycle. It doesn't have to just be that you'd use monetary policy, but the way we've gravitated to a system whereby the central bank is independent and it sets policy to try and manage that cycle, because, fiscal policy doesn't always end up being set in a way that manages the cycle as effectively. So that's the system we have, and it works. It's not perfect, as I said, but it works fairly well. And this was the first country to have adopted this system that all the other countries around the world have effectively moved towards over time.
I'm not sure it's something we're ready to sing and celebrate about just at the moment, only because we've been recently scarred.
That's true.
And I know
but it's worth keeping in mind that interest rates are now coming down.
Exactly, yeah.
And they're probably going to come down a bit further yet. And that's going to start to stimulate, that is already starting to stimulate the economy into an upswing. And that's a positive. Inflation was the major problem. Inflation's come down now. It's sitting around the midpoint of the RBNZ's target band. So they've been able to lower interest rates and start to stimulate the economy.
Paul, thank you very much for coming in. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Paul Bloxham, HSBC Chief Economist, with us in studio.
Heather du Plessis-Allen Drive, weekdays from 4 on Newstalk ZB.